And folks, this is somebody new, CEO of OGC. Is that correct?
That's right.
And we're excited to learn more about Peter as he enters this role at OGC. Sir, would you mind introducing yourself? And we'll find out a little bit more about you before we dive into what you're getting yourself into.
Thanks, Adam. Be happy to. So I am a geographer originally by training and also an economist. And I had an early love of computers. So I combined computers and geography. And I'll date myself. I started getting involved with GIS about 1984. And I've had a career that's moved in and out of geography over the years. Most of my background is in private business. I've had several software companies, one of which I sold to Thomson Reuters, and then I did corporate M&A work for about 3 years. And then I worked for Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay, with his investment impact firm, for about 8 years doing grants and investing, mostly for property rights. So our belief was that if you allow people to have the rights to the land that they occupy, whether it's leasing or owning, that this is the most powerful basis you can give someone for improving their livelihood and outcome. And there are three things you need to know when you deal with property rights. And I should say that most of the world doesn't have property rights, which is why we focused on it. So about 80% of Africa, for example, has no documentation about the land that people occupy, use, or live on.
Oh, wow.
Which becomes problematic, as you can imagine, because that means people live in informality. So here's the geography tie-in. You might say, you go for a bank account. What are the two things they ask you for? Your ID and a proof of an address. So if you don't have an address, you can't get a bank account. And that still happens in much of the world. So property rights needs three things: who, what, and where. So who are you? What rights do you say you have, and where are those rights? And so I was always fascinated how we could bring the where to this world of property rights and giving people formality, which led me to create a nonprofit called Place, which is now up and running, and which I'm now moving on from to join OGC as CEO. So I'm 3 days into the job.
Congratulations, that's amazing.
Thank you.
And that's an awesome story about property rights. I mean, that's a whole narrative on discrimination based off of location and the ability to even prove yourself, right, to the bank, and also your own existence to be able to have land, right? So that's incredible.
Yeah.
How long were you doing that, sir?
Well, with the Media Network, it was about 8 years.
Okay.
Heavily focused on property rights. It's an area that tends to be dominated by civil society organizations and lawyers. So it has a particular lexicon that's often hard to penetrate. It's highly jargonistic, much like GIS can be itself. So as a geographer and more of a systems person, we tried to bring simpler language and simpler approaches. So, what happens when you don't have property rights? What happens when you do have property rights? So I'll give you a good example. If you have the unfortunate circumstance of becoming a widow in much of Africa, then typically you now have no security whatsoever. And so whatever house or structure you may have had with your family can be seized, and is often seized by other family members or community members. And so widows become particularly vulnerable.
Oh, wow.
By not having any form of property rights, which then puts them highly at risk, typically with their children as well. So that's a really nasty outcome for not having property rights. And of course, there are many, many others. You can simply get evicted. You can get bulldozed. You can come back. We don't get children's participation in education or women in education because they often stay home to try and protect the home, to have someone there.
That makes sense.
Right?
That's really an unspoken factor into why these things have occurred.
Right, and there are direct implications for why we have lower female employment rates, right, lower educational rates, etc. The fundamental of having a secure place to live and call your home is I think we overlook it here in the West because we take it for granted.
Well, man, I'd love to dive more into that topic at some point.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, your role in OGC, talk to me about that transition into this role and what's got you excited about joining OGC, and where do you want to take that organization?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things. I think for me as a geographer and having had this varied background, I've reached the point in my life where I can sort of sit back and look at trends. And actually, I've never been more excited about geospatial than I am now, and about the opportunity and the time that we have. I think this is the best time I've seen in the marketplace for the last 30 years for geospatial, simply because of its adoption, its integration, and its use. So I see a huge opportunity. At the same time, much of the larger conversation that's going on around LLMs, AI, ethics, data use, data ownership, data stewardship, data governance, right? All these things. So your data that the platforms store, all these discussions about should I own this, should I be able to benefit from it? That conversation is going on at a much higher level and a faster pace than geospatial typically is associated with. So I think there's an opportunity to become part of the bigger conversation and to have geospatial more prominent at the forefront of large policy discussions, convenings and research and work around data, technology and society in general. So I think for that, we should stop putting geo in front of everything. It's a personal annoyance of mine because it's AI for geospatial, which is a fundamental difference.
So not geo AI,
No.
but more, like you just said, AI geo instead.
Yeah, I mean, geo AI to me says we have this little world, we're special, and we're going to make something called geo AI, and there's this huge world of AI. And they know nothing about geo. And if you create geo, and they're like, what's that?
Well, in reality, geospatial technology as a whole supplements and supports everything else. Everything doesn't support us.
Yeah.
We support. We're a services industry in some ways.
Well, we're an infrastructure layer.
Yeah.
Okay, we're what in the investment world we'd say is a horizontal. And a horizontal gives you tremendous opportunities, but challenges at the same time. So the big challenge is that, like a geographer, you're often accused of being a jack of all trades and a master of none, right? But that's your great strength as geography. You're everywhere. You underpin so much. You make many things or many verticals that much better. So if I think about health delivery and the efficacy of vaccine delivery to at-risk communities, I'm going to be much more efficient when I apply geospatial data and technology to that vertical application. So I'm a service, I'm a layer, I'm an infrastructure. So that's an opportunity and a challenge because you can hide in plain sight, if you want another axiom. So I think there's opportunity to leverage and really elevate geospatial in a broader policy and technology conversation. At the same time, we've often been known, OGC, as a standards organization. I think if you ask most people what they understand about OGC, they'll say standards.
Maintaining OGC formats and say, yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think if you look at the history of OGC, OGC was created to solve a very real problem at the time, which is that much of the data that was produced by commercial software in the late 80s into the early 90s was proprietary in nature. And if you look back in your history books, you'll see that Autodesk was sued around its DWG format. Adobe had similar issues with PDF, and there were others as well. It was a business tactic at the time to acquire market share and keep market share. This additional lock-in of, in order to use this key data that you've built up, you have to use certain software packages. And as you had specialization with new software, let's say, advanced 3D terrain analysis in the late 80s, then you really would struggle to get your data out of where you were keeping it in whatever commercial software at the time. So OGC was set up to allow interoperability of data around open data standards, interfaces, and protocols, so that you could make use of your data without being locked into a particular vendor.
Do you feel like that isn't much of a need now, or do you feel like it's just a changing ecosystem where that's a demand, but you also feel like there's a demand where OGC can answer the call in other ways?
Yeah. So I think at the time it was hugely useful. I think it showed the value of how an open infrastructure, open ecosystem could create opportunity for everyone, value for everyone. So grow the pie, not chew away on a limited pie. Even the commercial vendors realized that interoperability of data that, back then actually did more for them. And so their fear of losing that control was unfounded. I think the challenge is when you're very well known for one thing and you've done it really well and you've created opportunity, value, enhancement, and you've broken down some barriers, you may not always keep up with where the industry is. So the opportunity and challenge I see for OGC is how do we move fast? Standards are only as good as the ones that are used. And how do you balance between the need to have certain standards around things like pre-competitive goods that help shape and move markets? So the government may invest in a core new technology, and you need to develop that very carefully because it's got to integrate with large, big systems. But how do you also allow agile new standards to spring up, like STAC, for example,
right.
STAC? So this is a challenge for us. How do we balance the need in certain circumstances for heavily engineered, very process-oriented standards with the speed at which market moves and how the open community can, in an agile way, develop, and you have de facto standards, so it's almost de jure de facto. So we have to be able to serve both of those. But I think in general, we've got to become more nimble, more adaptive. And as one of my sort of guides in the industry always said, standards should in volumes. And that is the idea that really if a standard's not being used heavily, then probably time to move on.
So are you going to, how do you evaluate and survey the industry to figure out which standards are being used more than others? Because I know OGC holds the standards, but they don't host the APIs necessarily for the standards. So how do you do those types of metrics?
It's a really good question. I think you start by deciding what metrics you can measure, and I think that'll be something that we need to work on. Surveys are one obvious ways to do that. But what I'd like to do is have the community tell us. So I'd like to have improved interaction with the community on how is this actually being used. One of the ways we can do that is whatever media holdings we have or technology holdings we do have, we can track interactions with those. If those are repositories of GitHub, for example, we can tell how often things might be used, checked in, checked out. So there will be some mechanical ways we can do it, but obviously there'll be other ways that we'll have to look at it.
Absolutely. So I also understand that OGC is a great benchmark to help industry reality check on themselves, because government oftentimes can't move as fast as industry, and they're working on reliable older standards that still make sense to them,
right.
and they're stable. Oftentimes industry moves way too quickly, want to put out new standards or their own formats once again,
right.
in such a way they forget that a lot of these legacy customers have to be interoperable with a whole set of other customers. And I think OGC has been great about reminding industry that say, hey, this is great, but you still need to work with a whole layer of other factors and clients.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the metrics are incompatible with industry and government both. How would you manage that?
Well, there's a lot to be discussed
Right.
with the team, and there's a lot of knowledge with the existing staff that we have, that we have to be very careful that we take advantage of and use. But I think there's a difference between keeping formats interoperable and being overly process driven, right? And so I think you don't have to deprecate things right away. You can decide how long you will use it. If you have one key member who says, I would like to keep this particular format supported in some way, then you can keep that standard alive. But if that's a format, then unless you're sort of moving from microfilm to CD-ROM to other hard drives with so much digital in digital formats, as long as you can read and write to a format, you can get access to it. So I think defining how, what you mean by process, what you mean by protocol, what you mean by interface, and what you mean by data format, and how you keep the support for those. I think the danger with standards always is it's human nature. We tend to build bureaucracy on top of things over time. We don't do particularly well to say, well, if we've done it like this for 20 years, do we need to still do it the same way? What is the goal of what we're trying to do here by supporting an old legacy format and not getting too process driven? At the same time, with the move to cloud native formats and more operations in the cloud, with huge volumes of data, the need to keep data in place and communicate and interact between large repositories of data, it's shifting where we need to be in terms of agility and the standards that we set. We're simply not moving data around in the way we used to on big drives shipped by overnight. I think those days are coming to an end to some degree, although many geographies will have that for some time to come. But certainly in Western Europe or in Europe and in the US, the cloud has really, I think, shifted things for us, and we have to look at how we adapt best to that.
Okay, so you mentioned that, or at least you kind of hinted that OGC not just working on, not just maintaining, figuring out the legacy of standards or figuring out the future of standards. Where do you see OGC fitting into the community beyond just maintaining and managing standards?
I think, we're a nonprofit. We have membership from many industry and other sectors. I think we have an opportunity to continue to be a trusted space and a trusted voice around efficiency of protocols, interoperability, and standards that balances the needs of our different members. So I think we have an opportunity to grow that. I think we have an opportunity to, if our members see value in us performing certification and logo badging around new formats, then we want to be there to service them for that. I think we have a tremendous opportunity to grow globally, because I think OGC largely has been North America and Europe, and there is tremendous activity in Africa in particular, and as well as the Middle East and the Gulf states, and Asia, where we see in India, for example, about 3 years ago, a new geospatial law, which has unlocked enormous value for geospatial in India.
Oh, what is this law?
Well, it unlocks and moves the traditional approach of geospatial being a security concern to one that has social benefit, societal benefit. And so it's less restrictive now in who can collect, use, share, and develop geospatial data and applications. So until 3 years ago, it was heavily regulated and had a very high security concern to it, for understandable reasons. But it's a much more modern, forward-looking, progressive law that has allowed innovation to really spur. And I think there's opportunity for us to engage both there as well as further east as well.
So beyond policy and international concerns, and where driving where OGC can help organizations figure out their geospatial issues, OGC has also been a huge advocate for individual open source, we'll call it creators of different formats, files, standards, who also maintain how to keep data open. Do you how I guess what's your thoughts on continue to support that side of things, that we'll call it the individual, the smaller minority of folks that really bring open source and advocate for it, beyond just industry and government?
So I think we can do a better job, actually, because if you look at Stack did not come out of OGC. Stack came out of more of the community that you're referring to. And so I think we can get better, actually, at creating a more innovative community environment for the community to engage and bring up standards like Stack going forward. So I had quite a bit of overlap with open data standards, not just geospatial, at my time at Omidyar. And so I think we can bring some ethical layers and considerations to the policy discussions around open data. I think the open data environment and open government practitioners have realized that open by default is not always a good thing, that you have to be careful, that there can be unintended consequences by making data open by default. And I also think that a lot of people, or a lot of governments in particular, have signed up for open data and then pitch PDFs over the fence and say, have at it. And that's not particularly helpful, because if it's not machine readable and you have to spend all your time deciphering tens of thousands of PDF files, it meets the definition of open data, but is it useful?
Right. So you have to create an entire narrative on defining what open data really is.
I don't think we have to. I think that'd be a mistake. There's been an awful lot of work in the open data field.
Well, the community should, right?
Yeah, I think we can leverage what's already been done. This was back to my earlier point of don't stick geo, so don't call it geoethics. There's a whole vibrant world that has done an awful lot of thinking, and still does, with support on ethics and data. So it's ethics for geospatial, and geospatial coming to the ethics table to say, hey, you've got to be considerate of what happens when you add location, particularly when you add time and space to the collection of data, right? It offers up boundless opportunities for tracking people in real time, for example. Things that might not come to the mind of people working on open data who are looking at personal health data, right? Or other data they may not think of the geospatial community. So I think this is what I meant. There's an opportunity for us to work on this. I will say one of the things that we funded at Omidyar Network is now called the LOCUS Charter, LOCUS. I'm not sure if you're familiar.
No, I have not heard of it.
So we gave a grant to the American Geographical Society.
Okay.
And they created something called Ethical Geo.
Oh, I'm familiar with that,
okay.
Yes.
And we gave a grant to the Ordnance Survey in the UK, and they developed something called Benchmark. And then the two came together and created Locus Charter, which is a set of 10 principles for the ethical use of location data. And I would like to see more of that being interjected into the discussion and dialogue around open data, because I can point us back to an unfortunate event with the Harvard Signal program, using 1 meter satellite data to help the very first Sudan and crisis around the Janjaweed, the group, the paramilitary group that was terrorizing ordinary Sudanese civilians. And so the idea was to use high resolution 1 meter satellite data and identify where all the humanitarian camps and the refugees were and where the aid needed to go. And it was all well-intentioned, and it was made open.
Oh, but the opposing forces use the same technology.
Turned out they did, and they used it to target aid workers and refugees with horrible consequences. So as a result, there was the development of what's called the Signal Code, which you can find on the Harvard School of Theology website. And so, you know, we need to think about these things. They have real-world ramifications. We can't be Pollyannish in the idea that we should just make everything open.
Good intentions, but there's consequences to both sides.
Yes, there are unintended consequences. Right. So setting principles, setting process. So I think OGC can play a real role here as a trusted convener of thought, of practice, and of different community types to a broad community to say, let's have a really good discussion on, you know, let's be open, but let's be careful.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, I have two more questions as we wrap up. The first one is, you know, talking further on the advocacy for open source and overall. How do you see working with other groups that have their own way of advocating for, we'll say, their own standards and their own policies they're trying to drive? And I mean groups like OSGeo or ASPRS or the IEEE IGARS organizations. And in some level, I think they complement what OGC and the rest of the community is doing. In other ways, I think they, it's not say competing, but they have conflicting. It can be a little bit conflicting to figure out as a user or industry and government, you know, where to lean and who to focus on. It's just like different schools of philosophy in that regard.
Yeah. So I think it comes back to all trying to fish in a small pond. And when you have to fish in a small pond in terms of funding and resources, I think you get a lot of unnecessary conflict. I think if you have an idea that there's a bigger pot and a bigger pool, then there's more room for different views, opposing views. First of all, there's nothing wrong with competition.
Right.
It's actually very good for the consumer, the end user. And I think as long as people are open and have a debate about what's best, that's good. On the other hand, I've never gotten anywhere personally in business without partnerships. And so, you know, you have to find the common ground. You have to say, what can we do together? So 1 + 1 = 3. And then we can reach the larger pool together instead of saying, well, you know, and having very defined, finite technical arguments about whether something is better or not. At the end of the day, the market judges who's the winner.
Right. I mean, it's your users who will eventually decide.
Absolutely. So if you're agile, if you're customer oriented, if your standard works, the market will likely adopt it.
That makes sense. Well, sir, one more question for you is there anything you would like our audience or the rest of the industry to know about your new role as CEO of OGC that we can hear your thoughts on?
We'd love to hear from you.
Okay.
I think this will be an interesting new chapter for OGC. I come at this from a different background than perhaps previous CEOs. That's not to say that's better or worse, it's different. But I want to hear what has worked for people. What do they think OGC does well? What do they think OGC doesn't do well? If they were members before and are not now, why? How can we get you back? How can we grow our membership? What can we do better? So I have told the team that we need to be, and I in particular need to be on a listening tour to hear from members that are no longer members, people who would be interested in becoming members, and people who say, I'll never be a member.
I understand why that is.
And absolutely understand why that is. And understand we may never change the mind of some, that's okay, but at least I want to have an open dialogue and an honest dialogue with people, and we can agree to disagree, but we do want to hear from people.
Great. Well, sir, it will be exciting to see how you change and evolve the organization. I love seeing that OGC has somebody like you on board, and have enjoyed the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam.
I'm Adam Simmons with Project Geospatial here at the GEOINT 2024 Symposium here in Orlando, and we'll talk to everybody next time.